Hello and welcome to our live online talk on lost medieval villages. There are lost, deserted and shrunken medieval villages scattered all over Britain, and each one has its own unique story to tell. Once home to thriving medieval communities, these ruined settlements are now puzzles waiting to be solved by archaeologists. Why did they get lost? Why were they abandoned? And what can we learn from them? From heartless landlords to climate change, many of the themes that we're going to be discussing tonight will feel very familiar today. In this online talk, we're going to explore the lost medieval villages of Britain, what the footprints of these settlements and the discoveries made by archaeologists can tell us about the people who once lived here and why they left, and even how you can help us to uncover one for yourself. I'm Maya, I'm an archaeologist and director of engagement at DigVentures, and here with me tonight to help demonstrate some of the typical discoveries made by archaeologists at medieval settlements is Freddie.
Hello.
And in the background, we also have Ginny on tech and Maggie, our virtual bouncer. And then, of course, here with us tonight, there are all of you, and we're excited to see how you're all going to get involved in helping us to uncover medieval villages with us tonight. So, coming up tonight, we have quite an exciting agenda of conversation. We'll be starting with what are deserted medieval villages? What causes them to be deserted? We'll talk our way through some famous examples of deserted medieval villages that have already been uncovered by archaeologists and show you some examples of the kinds of things that get found among the ruins. Last but not least, we're going to talk you through how you can help us to uncover one. And then with any remaining time, we will devote ourselves to a Q&A. So if you have any questions, store them up, drop them in the chat, and we'll come to them at the end. Next up, let's just start with a little bit of housekeeping since this is a live event. Importantly, the most important things to know are use the chat and the comments to submit Q&A questions for the end. Do feel free to chat to each other, say what your favourite deserted medieval village is or where you're from, but make sure any conversation that you have in the chat is kept kind, constructive and friendly, or you'll risk being booted out by our virtual bouncer. And last but not least, please be patient with us if any tech goes wrong. So, are we all ready? I think we are. Let's get started. So, what is a deserted medieval village? It's quite a big topic, actually. They're hugely varied. But let's start with the basics. There are over 3,000 deserted medieval villages across the UK. There are more remains often found in the Midlands and the north of England, but every single one of them is unique and has a different story to tell. The loosest possible definition that we can give to a deserted medieval village is that it's simply a settlement of medieval date which has been abandoned, lost, or depopulated over the centuries. In terms of their history, we know that settlements and human settlements have obviously been around for thousands of years, but in the UK, the idea of an organised village only really begins to pick up in the 9th and 10th centuries, according to what we can see in the archaeological evidence. There are many different theories as to why that is. It can be an organic change, perhaps community-led change, a result of population growth, perhaps paired with rural reorganisation instigated by kings and landowners in order to better manage rent and land production. Villages tend to become a little bit more organised in their construction and planning in the 11th century, and that's particularly notable after the harrying of the north by William the Conqueror. But of course, villages are just one type of medieval settlement. There are many, many different types. So of course, yes, we've got villages, but we also have hamlets, farmsteads, shielings, tofts, crofts, and even ports. They're all often hubs of agricultural production, industry or trade in some form or another combined with settlement. And the types of settlement can vary widely across England. So we tend to see that villages are more common in the central province versus hamlets and farmsteads, which tend to be more common in the upland country. So what is the difference then between a village and all of these different types of settlement? So hamlets and farms, they're a little bit different because they maybe they're specialist outlying centres of agricultural production, a little bit smaller, less organised, less formal, less planned than a medieval village. Shielings are temporary habitations, usually for upland grazing of animals, and farmsteads usually comprise barns and sheds for crops, animals, all within a toft, which is a hedged or walled plot of land with an adjoining garden or a plot for cultivation, agricultural industry, which is called a croft. So tofts and crofts then group together into settlements, and in larger planned villages, tofts and crofts would be regular in size, tending to group together into a main road, and then coming off that main road, you have the crofts and the tofts. And in smaller or more organic settlements, the groupings tend to be a bit more irregular, and often there would then be a church and a manor house present somewhere in the village. We can show you a couple of examples of what these look like. Let's get ourselves familiar with what they might look like. So at the top here, we've got a reconstruction of what a medieval village might look like, along with examples of where you might find them and how they might show up visibly in the landscape. So you can see that there are all sorts of shapes and sizes going on, and we've even got some that are not only on upland hillsides, but even there are some today that can only be found underwater. And we will come to that later. But for now, if we want to take a look again at the kind of layout that you might expect from crofts, tofts and villages, here we can see an example from Yarwell, a reconstruction based on archaeological excavations and what you can see in aerial imagery. It's rather beautiful when you start to look at it. So the big question then is, where can we find them? And how do they come to be abandoned? So in terms of finding them and being able to spot them for further investigation, they're often quite visible in the landscape as earthworks, and they'll show up on LiDAR surveys. So for example, here, what we've got is some LiDAR where you can see the outline of a medieval settlement and village on the LiDAR, along with the ridge and furrow that the villagers would have used for farming. And in fact, this particular example comes from a project that we've recently run called Deep Time, where we've trained lots of astronauts to search for archaeological sites using LiDAR imagery. So this is the kind of thing you might see. It's also possible to find out about deserted medieval villages from historic mapping and documents. And even if you're just walking through the countryside, you might see the kind of telltale lumps and bumps standing out in fields, demarcating the edges of crofts and tofts and holloways, buildings and housing platforms, and the edges of field systems as well. So there are all sorts of things that you can look for. One of the amazing things about deserted medieval villages is that because they've been abandoned, the wonderful thing is that they've been largely undisturbed ever since they were abandoned, which makes them a really important source of archaeological evidence for medieval life. In fact, there's often very little evidence for some of the poorest members of medieval society, so people like widowers and cottagers. The little evidence that we do have often shows that they lived in small dwellings on the corners of these settlements, perhaps occupied by their children, or on the periphery of villages or on the wayside. And it's these kinds of populations that we don't tend to hear about in historical documents. And again, that's one of the reasons why the study of deserted medieval villages is just so fascinating and important. The archaeological excavation of these sites can be really extensive, but really, really valuable. So as well as looking at the layout of the villages that we can see from aerial imagery, looking at the plans, how many houses there were, we can also look at that through aerial photography, earthwork survey. We can back that up with documentary research as well. One problem with that, though, is that many villages were formed before the practice of record keeping was really established. And that's, again, why archaeological research can be so powerful. So what do archaeologists look for, again, when we're looking at these sites? Not just the layout of them, but what else can we really be thinking about when we get down on the ground and start digging through them? Well, we can be looking for evidence of domestic life, agriculture, the kinds of industries that they were after, and how the village evolved, how it grew and shrank over time as well. Now, of course, not all medieval villages were completely deserted, not all of the deserted medieval villages were completely deserted. There are different types and different patterns of abandonment. So some continue to be occupied into the present day in some form or other, but there are many that are called either crept or shrunken medieval villages. Now, these are ones where villagers have moved from their original location, sort of kind of almost migrated across the landscape in response to where and how people are building their homes and abandoning others. And then there are others that have simply shrunk a little bit in terms of size. And then, of course, you have the villages and the settlements that were completely abandoned in their entirety. And that leads us on rather nicely to the question of why were these settlements abandoned? Again, it's a really, really, really big question, and I'm going to try and take you through some of the highlights and some of the different reasons that are going on here. So the first thing to point out is that there's no single reason why all of these villages were abandoned. Again, every single village has its own unique story. In the early days of studying medieval villages, it's only really a discipline that's taken off in the last 50 years, studying these in a kind of constructed way. In early days, thinking around why they were deserted and abandoned was quite generalised. Often people blamed most of it on the Black Death and how many people died, and that leading to a reduction in population and therefore villages needing to be abandoned, either because everybody had died or because people simply couldn't do all the work that was required to maintain a village with so few people. Then there were other factors as well, like the exploitation of land for more profitable pursuits. But then more recent thinking has grown, and it kind of accepts that settlements are kind of, in and of themselves, quite fluid entities. They shift and they change over time. They appear and they disappear across Britain as populations move in response to different economic, social, and environmental changes. So, for example, as we've just mentioned, the plague could be one reason. So many villages were abandoned either because everyone died or the people who survived simply couldn't do all the work themselves. One of the most surprising, I think, reasons that we probably overlook is actually sand. Sand, soil erosion, and climate change are huge causes of abandonment in many, many villages. And we'll come to that in a bit. But as a taste, over 300 settlements have been lost to coastal erosion in the North Sea basin in the last 900 years. And sand, again, is a really, really common reason that villages became abandoned. We then have things like deliberate depopulation and clearance of land by landlords, either for profit or for things like gentrification. So in the Middle Ages, the rising price of wool often led to sheep being a more profitable thing for landlords to do. So they would clear the land that had previously been used for agriculture by the tenants, by the villagers, and they switched over to sheep farming, and that resulted in widespread evictions and clearances. The other side of that as well is deliberate depopulation for gentrification. So aristocrats kind of, often got a taste for building mansions and parks and hunting grounds. Where they had a good bit of land that they wanted for their own reasons, they would clear those too and remove villages and convert the land into parks and hunting grounds. We then have things like raids and warfare. And of course, there are other social, cultural, and economic factors, including one supposed case of moral outrage, which again we'll come to shortly. We still see lots of these effects in our villages, towns, and cities today, as some places grow and prosper, others dwindle and decline. And there will often be multiple reasons why a village was abandoned. In other words, to understand and determine the story of an individual village, we need to study it itself. And archaeology is just one of the tools that we can use to explore these stories. And what kinds of stories do they then begin to tell us? Well, we're now going to take a look at some examples and have a look at what they can tell us about why they were abandoned, what their people were doing, and what was happening. So let's get started. Our first example is how climate change has led one medieval village to be abandoned. So this here example is Hounds Tor in Dartmoor. And if you walk out to Hounds Tor, you'll be able to retrace the steps of its medieval inhabitants. This village, which was actually excavated in the 1960s, includes a cluster of 13th century Dartmoor longhouses, barns, a small lean-to, corn drying ovens, and a kiln. But archaeological evidence shows us that sadly it wasn't actually inhabited for all that long. Population growth and favourable weather had encouraged people to move higher up onto the moor, taking in marginal land that was normally too difficult to cultivate, but at that time was good enough to cultivate. Pollen evidence that archaeologists uncovered then shows us that cereal farming ceased by 1350, while the corn dryers and the grain storage barns suggest that the inhabitants were struggling with a rapidly deteriorating climate. And in the end, despite it having a short period of prosperity, it was later abandoned as the inhabitants moved back downslope into more habitable zones. Our next example is of the famous sand. So sand is a really big reason why many coastal villages get abandoned. So this example here is Forvey in Aberdeenshire, abandoned sometime in the 15th century. The sand that had been transported down the river and deposited at the mouth of the estuary moved north and formed sand dunes, which now completely cover the village. Legends tell of a 9-day-long storm which ended up burying the village in sand. Today, the church is still visible, and archaeology has revealed the foundations of several medieval square huts, including paved floors, 13th and 14th century pottery, a font belonging to the church, and even stained glass has been recovered, providing really nice insight into the lives and the goods that the inhabitants would have had access to. Other examples might include places like Kenfig in Wales, which were also taken over by sand and abandoned in the 15th century. This is a famous example that was featured on Time Team and believed to have been founded around 1140 by the Earl of Gloucester. By 1397, historical records already suggest that sand was threatening to destroy the town. I'd love to see it in the chat if any of you can think of other examples of medieval villages that have been affected by wind-blown sand and that have been abandoned because of it. On a similar note, it seems that coastal villages are quite under threat by what's going on. So probably one of the most famous examples that you'll all have heard of is Dunwich. So Dunwich in East Anglia is almost entirely submerged now below the North Sea. But it does make it Europe's largest underwater medieval site. But back in the day, it was a thriving port that once rivaled London. But then it was battered by a series of powerful storms in the 13th and 14th century, and the harbour as a result started to silt up. With a failing market as a result, the town was partly destroyed by storms, and then some violent disputes with piratical monks. The storms quite literally tipped the village over the edge, and many people simply gave up on Dunwich. When archaeologists explored the underwater ruins, they found the ruins of 4 churches, a toll house, several shipwrecks, and new evidence of the port that was once the capital of Anglo-Saxon East Anglia. It's quite amazing to see the sonar images that have been produced, and on the right here you can just see the outline of the church perched upon a rock poking out of the ground, and on the left you can see the original layout of the entire village. So you can see that half of it is now underwater, while today the other half survives. So this is an example of a town or a village that hasn't been completely abandoned, but rather shrunken as a result of climate and coastal erosion. Another famous example that has been in the news this week, in fact, is Ravensor Odd. Another quite incredible story. So this was a town founded under the charters of King Edward I, dating to 1299. And it's been in the news this week because a new exhibition is opening in Hull, all about the backstory of this village. Again, for a moment, this village was a thriving port. It had been, built in a very strategic location. But the power of coastal erosion meant that it didn't last long, and very quickly it was taken away and silted up, and only really now visible as a result of sonar surveys under the water, which suggests there are some structures that may still be present. Probably one of the most unexpected causes of people leaving their villages is, landlords. I mean, I think that's something that we all hear about today, the cruelty of landlords who want to use their properties for the most profitable reasons. And we all hear terrible stories of people being evicted and left without homes. And this is something that happened back in medieval times as well. So the idea that landlords could make a profit from their land was very, very prevalent. And here we have two of the most famous examples of where this happened. So at the bottom here, we've got an aerial image of Rand in Lincolnshire. So this is an example of a classic and quite heartbreaking example of a medieval village that grew rapidly until the landlords decided to basically boot everyone out in the 1500s to make way for the more profitable sheep farming. Detailed archaeological work, though, has managed to reveal the village's principal streets, along which you can see that the village expanded in the 12th or 13th century. You can even still see the plots for the houses on both sides of the streets, with platforms representing front yards. There's a second holloway as well, also with houses, which represents a later period of expansion and an area of ridge and furrow cultivation to the north, which is all that's left of the open fields that surround the village. Similarly, we've got Warren Percy here, again, another example of a prospering or supposedly prospering village being cleared for profit. So this has been investigated by archaeologists now for over 60 years and is probably Britain's most famous deserted medieval village. The discoveries here at Warren Percy are really important, have been really important for the wider study of medieval settlement as a whole in England. We know that the population declined following the Black Death in about 1349, and some houses remained. But quite interestingly, the economy here appeared to recover, and there was another slight boom in occupation of the site before, again, another population decrease in around 1458. Like Rand, village life largely came to an end when the landowners forcibly evicted the villagers and destroyed their homes to make way for more profitable sheep farming. But if you visit today, you can again still walk among the ruins of its church, manor houses, and 40 peasant houses. Among them, quite intriguingly, archaeologists have found invaluable evidence of village life, including some remarkable signs of belief in the living dead. So they found human remains that had been buried and burnt, mutilated and decapitated and dismembered. Now, this isn't anything that's thought to have happened at the time of the village being abandoned, but rather a reflection of the idea that in medieval times, people were highly concerned with the idea of restless corpses who might arise from the dead and spread disease and misfortune. There was a lot happening in these times, and you can really start to think and understand why these kinds of things might have happened. And excavations at Warren Percy have been really, really powerful in showing us some of those trends that were happening in these medieval villages. But of course, it wasn't, again, it's another example of a village that wasn't entirely abandoned. There's some evidence, again, for evidence of people occupying it in the 16th century. There are jetons, there are post-medieval material found on site, and in fact, some farmers remained. The last residents only left in the 1950s, which marked the end of the final occupation of the site. We also have another example here of how Warren Percy has been reconstructed. So based on all of the archaeological evidence that you can see, we've got some rather lovely layouts of how the village would once have looked. Again, so we're coming back again to the cruelty of medieval landlords. So these two examples here show how landlords with very little concern for their villagers would often evict them and clear the way to make way for the things that they wanted on their estates. So at Kirby in Northamptonshire, we know that this one was cleared to make way for essentially what was a very posh garden. So it sits today, these ruins sit today in the grounds of an estate, but you can still clearly see the outline of some of the crofts, tofts, and even a buried fish pond. The village was always pretty small, but it was finally dissolved around 1600 to make place for a small, formal Jacobean garden. Clearly, the landlords at the time didn't want any unsightly peasants ruining the view. You can also see here East Matfern in Durham, a very, very similar story, a small village that was cleared to make way for a park. And on the right, a rather fascinating example, which we're going to come back to, is the lost medieval village of Sudeley, which is thought to have been made way, which is thought to have been cleared to make way for Sudeley Castle, which now stands on the site. And we're going to come back to that example in more detail. But before we move on to the next section, I just want to have a look at one last example. So this is Gainsthorpe in Lincolnshire, which supposedly was ruined by moral outrage among the local population. So this is one of the best preserved medieval villages around, and its footprint is still clearly visible as a series of linear lumps and bumps. There are ancient streets that survive as worn holloways, and on either side there are individual houses separated by low banks with the tofts, which are the frontage plots that once contained buildings, and sunken yards, the garden crofts that stretch behind. According to legend, it had become a den of thieves and was demolished by unhappy locals. The truth of this, however, remains slightly unknown, and it may have simply suffered the fate of other nearby villages, which were subject to plague, soil erosion, sandblowing, and now here's what really may have been going on again: deliberate depopulation. In the words of the 17th century writer Abraham de la Prime, he said, "I fancy the town was eaten up with time, poverty, and pasturage." Well, now, isn't that a convenient excuse for depopulation? So I think just from these examples, you can see how fascinating it is to study these lost medieval villages, not only from the layout and what's happened to them, but the small details of the lives of the villagers that we can uncover. So what I'd like to do now is bring in Freddie, who can talk us through and show us some examples of the kinds of things that archaeologists might find when excavating the remains of lost medieval villages.
Yes, thank you for that, Maya. Anyone who doesn't know me, I am Freddie. I'm a community archaeologist at DigVentures, but my main role is to do with our finds. I look after all of our finds here in our base and also on site as well. So I've got a nice collection of finds in front of me today that I've selected from our archives that are the kind of finds that you would expect to find in a medieval village. They're not all of them, because we might be here for a while if I brought all the finds you could possibly get. But I think these are a good example to show you kind of the different things you can find from a deserted medieval village. And to begin with, I have got in front of me here a nice mandible of a cow. Now the teeth unfortunately have broken off a bit. You can see there's a few still remaining there. Hopefully you can see it. Still, there you go. Yeah, you can see the top of the tooth there, and you might be thinking, oh, it's just a bit of animal bone. How useful is that? Well, it can actually tell us quite a lot, because depending on the kind of animal it is, the part of the animal it is, and also kind of the what's been done to it as well, if there are any cut marks and things. So the most common animals you'll find in a medieval village are your cows, your sheep, your goats, your pigs, kind of your livestock. You'd also get horses as well as dogs, and you also get deer sometimes. The wilder animals tend to be a lot more rarer, like squirrels and rabbits and things, because in the medieval period it was actually quite a privilege to hunt. So the more common things are livestock, the domestic animals. You can also get occasionally larger mammals. We have an example of a bear claw that we found in Lindisfarne, and that was from the medieval period. And we're not quite sure at the moment, but we're thinking it might be from someone's rug. Not an actual live bear that they kept on the island, rather a nice luxury trade. Which brings me on to the different functions, the different uses of animals. They weren't just for meat. Meat was actually quite rarely eaten in the medieval period. It was a lot more plant-based diets, and so a lot of the animals were actually used for their secondary sources, the renewable products that they could give you. So that's things like wool, milk, even manure for the fields. All of those things would have been utilized, as well as the primary products like the meat and the hide and the bone as well. Uh, so it could tell us a lot about what was going on in that village. For example, what they ate, but also what were they doing. So you can find a lot if you find a lot of skulls and a lot of lower limbs in one particular area. That's probably leather making, because that was very useful to stretch out the animal so that they could process the hide as well as kind of roll it up and easy to carry. And you can also find glue making in villages, which is, if you find a lot of the feet, they was often broke down for a lot of the kind of cartilage that was in them, and that often smelt a lot as well. So you actually tend to find things like tanneries in like the edges of villages. If you do find them, you don't always find them. They're more of a thing that you find in cities, but they are known to be in villages. So this is a lot of that we could just get from just the animal, from IDing it, and from what part of it it is. But as I said before, you also have other products that you can use from it, and one of those is using it in tools and making nice things from the bone. Particularly, the example I have here is the handle of a knife, a dinner knife. You can see here it's nicely carved with all the grooves in it, and the blade would have been at this end. Unfortunately, it's quite degraded. It's in quite a few pieces at the moment, and we don't have all of it. But the handle has survived really nicely. So this is the whole of the handle. It's quite a small one, but it would have been definitely used as probably a dinner knife or as a kind of almost like a pen knife. Think something like that. But that's a really nice example of the different uses of animals in medieval villages. Now, the next common artifact that you'll tend to find, animal bones is probably the most common thing you'll find in a medieval village. The second most is pottery. And I've got here a nice example of your quintessential green glaze pottery from a medieval village. So if I hold this close to the camera, hopefully you can see that shine on it. If you can see it, it's a kind of a yellowy green, and that's still green glaze. Kind of the branch term is green glaze, but the green glaze actually came. It could be quite yellow, it could be quite brown. It did actually come in lots of different shades of green, really, and that was a lot kind of a newer thing in the high medieval period. So the post early medieval period, you tend to see a lot more glazes coming through and a lot more slips, which is it's like a wet clay layer applied when they fire it, which gives it gives a different color. Not as shiny as a glaze, but it still is a nice finish. And so that they're wheel thrown. They're not handmade like we get in the early medieval period, but they're less varied in terms of their form. So this, you can see, is a nice handle. It's probably a handle for something like a jug, which is kind of the most common kind of vessel that we get made from pottery in the medieval period. And that is, it's a whole of liquids, all kinds of different liquids, water, alcohol, things like that. But you also get jars, flagons. My favourite kind of vessel is something called a bunghole jar, where it was a type of jar that had it had a tripod stand built into it, and then a hole at the bottom where the bung would go in, and it was used to make beer, and because when they're fermenting it or distilling it, kind of all the sediment that's like really like almost poisonous to you, that you don't want to drink, falls to the bottom, and then the bunghole's just above the top of it, and you can open it up and drink the nice sediment-free alcohol. So I particularly like that piece. But not all vessels were made from pottery. You get most of the vessels that we know that we do find is pottery, and is not as common as all of the pottery that you find in the Roman period, where if you find thousands of sherds from the Roman period, you might just find like a couple hundred from the medieval period. And that's because a lot of their vessels were actually made from wood, and that just doesn't survive. So we just don't have as much. But it's still nice, and I have another piece here, which it wasn't just crude; it was quite nice, and they've done a nice little, a nice grooved decoration in that one. I particularly like that, and that's probably from the same vessel as this as well, and that wasn't actually found in a medieval village. That was actually found at Pontefract Castle, the gatehouse there, when we did an excavation in 2019. Yes, so those are the kind of the two main finds that you get in a medieval village. But then you get some of the nicer things, and some of the more unusual things. You pick them up and think, what is that? What was that used for? And one of my favourite things is this, which it doesn't look that impressive when you first see it. Hold that. Yeah, what it is lead, and specifically it's a lead cane. And caning was the art of joining lots of different pieces of glass together to make a nice image, also known as stained glass. So that's something that if you're getting that in a village, you might be near the church possibly, or a nice wealthy house as well. So if you're finding stuff like that, you're in like a quite wealthy place. So that's really nice to find. The glass doesn't tend to survive as well. It's just too fragile. It tends to break apart and degrade too much. But the lead definitely does survive. So I do like that. And another thing that we have, I'm going to be very careful with this because it's quite delicate. We've got here, very careful. So this is a pin. It's a copper pin, and we found this on Lindisfarne, and that is, it's one of those very personal items because someone's clearly used that probably for their hair or something like that, or as a clothing, furniture, something like that, and someone's held that, someone's actually used that, and I find it very very personal when you find something like that. So yeah, not just day-to-day use things to make you look nice as well. Now we're going to go into the more detailed stuff, and I actually have got with me here a nice digital microscope. So we'll flip to that. So here, hopefully you can see, I'm going to show you how small this is. So this is a coin, and I'm going to put a pencil next to it. If you can see, put it in there we go. So that's the tip of the pencil. So it is a really, really small coin. It's a silver coin, and it's from Edward IV. And this side is the long cross form, which is the reverse side. The side that, it's very useful in terms of IDing the coin, but it's also not as interesting as the other side, which I'll turn over now. Hopefully I'll get the orientation right. There we go. So we've now got a nice little bust there of Edward IV. You can see, I'm going to use the pencil if you can see. So you've got his eyes there, his ear, his mouth, his crown at the top, just here. Hopefully you can see that. So there, this is a coin which is very useful for us for dating, and it's a silver coin though. So again, this is probably one of the more wealthier coins that you'll find, and I think it's really nice, and it's in really good condition considering how old it is. So opposed to a coin, what we also have is, it's a bit bigger. What we have here is a token. So a token is not the same as a coin. It's not technically currency. You can also see the hole there, which shows us that it is a token, because you wouldn't actually have that hole for currency. This would be kept on some string. And tokens, their use is when it's quite a period of a tough period for people. People actually use tokens for small transactions, or as like a representative for transactions where they would then pay back the money later on. And I like the detail on this one. So this is made of copper. I really like the four fleur de lis on the in the middle there. I really like that. Unfortunately, the edges of it don't survive as well, so they're less legible. But we do know it is a token. And then finally, move that to the side. We have this, which I'll try and get. There we go. Move that there. Awesome. So this is really cool. So this is a silver cufflink. We have one and a half of these that we found on site, and it's got the heart with a flame in the middle on the top of it, with two arrows going through it. Now that is uh, an image associated with Charles II. So we're going quite into the late medieval, early post-medieval period here. But what's really cool about this one is the fact that this was found at Sudeley Castle, and so uh, I'll bring it back to Maya, and she can tell you all about it.
Hello, I'm back, and thank you so much, Freddie, for sharing all of those fascinating examples of things that have been found on archaeological sites and abandoned medieval villages across the UK by our team and by our community as well. And you're absolutely right, Freddie. That last one is really, really intriguing. So I think, as you mentioned, when we first found it, we thought, oh, maybe it's a Victorian button, but no, it turns out to be a late medieval cufflink from the site of Sudeley Castle, which leads us extremely nicely into the question of how can you all help us to uncover another abandoned medieval village? So, some of you might know that over the last few years, we've been doing a lot of research around the grounds of Sudeley Castle, where in the last few years we've unearthed the remains of a Tudor garden. And now that Tudor garden has its own incredible story, but we'll save that one for later. But alongside that, in the last year, we've taken a look at the LiDAR and we've found something probably even more exciting. It looks like the remains of housing plots, and you can see on this image here, marked in green, an area that we think is probably worthy of excavation to try and figure out if these remains that we can see in the LiDAR really might be the remains of housing plots. Now, if they are, that would answer a really significant question that has been hanging over Sudeley Castle for a very long time. And that is the question of what on earth ever actually happened to the medieval village of Sudeley. So we know that there was a village once upon a time, a village called Sudeley. This settlement was actually recorded in the Domesday Book in 1086, and at the time it was said to have had a population of 40 households, including 18 villagers, 8 smallholders, 7 slaves, and 7 female slaves. At the time, it was owned by Harold, son of Lord Ralph, and was said to have also had 4 lords' plough teams and 13 men's plough teams. Now, we think from what we know that this village was occupied for some 400 years before eventually it disappeared. And the story goes that this was because it was cleared to make way for the castle whose construction began in 1443. So you can see the beautiful palace and castle in the top image here. It is a stunning thing, and really full of history as well. But fascinatingly, in the process of building that, we uncover the story of a landlord who cleared the land to make way for something that they wanted to build without too much concern for the villagers at the time. They may not have been concerned about those villagers, but we are. We really want to uncover their story and find out more about them. Who were these 18 villagers, these smallholders and supposed slaves? What happened to them? What about the plough teams? What were their houses like? What were their homes like? And can we bring any clarity to the story of what happened to the village? When was it founded? How much did it grow? Did it shrink? What happened with the ravages of time? Was it too affected by things like the plague, by sand, as we may have seen, by raids, by warfare, by all the things that were happening in the medieval period? How did these villages live through those times? Now, that's something that we really, really want to find out. And this year in October, we will be returning to Sudeley Castle to open a new excavation area specifically designed to examine this potential lost medieval village. And that's exactly where you come in. We, of course, always want you guys to come and help. We are crowdfunding a dig at the moment, which you can join and have a look at digventures.com/calendar, and you'll see the crowdfunding campaign there. Obviously, as always, you have multiple options. You can come and join us on the dig itself, get your hands dirty, and actually help to unearth the remains of the village. Or you can support us online and watch as the action unfolds and see what we discover. Will we find more cufflinks, more coins, more tokens, more animal bones? We don't know, but we sure can't wait to find out. And we hope the process of it as well will bring as big a smile of joy and excitement to your face as you can see on Ben's face there in the bottom right corner. Now, if you can't actually join us at Sudeley Castle, if you can't wait until October, you do have other options to join us and get involved. We have just launched a new archaeological field school at Sunken Hall in September, where we will, if you like the medieval theme, be exploring the story of the landscape at the heart of which sits a tiny medieval castle. Again, that's a story we've been excavating and unearthing for the last few years. And this year we've come to the crux of the story and are trying to understand some more features in the landscape surrounding this tiny castle. So if you're free in June, jump in and get involved. You'll be able to get hands-on with the dig and with finds and artefacts as well. Lots and lots of medieval artefacts for you to have a look at and learn more about. And last but not least, if you can't do either of those, if you can't come out into the field and dig, don't worry. We're doing loads more online events like this. We'll be doing virtual tours, more online talks, and we're about to release a new online course specifically about studying artefacts of all sorts, not just medieval artefacts, but artefacts of all periods, of different types of material, how to excavate them, care for them, study them, and learn lots more about them. So whether you want to come and join us in person or join us online, you've got three options there. You can come to dig with us and support our crowdfunding campaign at Sudeley Castle and help us to unearth the remains of a lost medieval village. You can join us at Sunken Hall in June for an archaeological field school, or you can support us online. If you love what we do and want us to keep doing more of it, come on, become a subscriber and join us online. We can't do it without you. It's because of all of you here that we get to do events like this and to share our knowledge and to learn together. On that note of learning and what we can do together, it's now time for the Q&A. So if you've got questions that you want answers to, then please do drop them in the chat and we will pick up on the questions that you've got there. I think I've seen one already coming in from, let's have a look, from Robin Jones, who has asked, do we have any suggestions for books on DMVs? Oh, well, you've opened quite a big can of worms there, Robin. Yes, we absolutely do. I'd like to start by saying there are loads of resources available from the Medieval Settlement Research Group, who have really kind of pushed forward the field of medieval settlement studies over the last 50 years, as well as from the Ordnance Survey and Royal Commission on Historical Monuments and Historic England. They all have quite interesting, useful, sort of quite technical documents that will give you the technical side of things. But if you want something a little bit more enjoyable, a little bit lighter read, something that maybe you can take on holiday with you, then I've got a couple of suggestions I will point to. So there is a book that is very handily titled Deserted Medieval Villages. Straight to the point, does what it says on the tin. We've also got Life in a Medieval Village by Francis Gies. And the medieval town. There are also lots of publications on the results of excavations from Warren Percy, which are really, really fascinating, really detailed, and you can get right into the detail of what was going on with all of those stories about the the dismembered skeletons and why they might have been so concerned about the living dead. But there's also another one that I think is really rather nice, which I'm sure many of you might have read, which is The Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England. And that one really gives quite a nice sense of what it was to live in those times in different settlements across the country. So hopefully that will help you get started and give you a place to start. And if you read any of them or have any of the other have any other suggestions of things to read, then please do share them in the chat. I think there is another question that has come up, which is, what about villages that have been destroyed by raids and warfare? Do we have any examples of that? So we've talked about lots and lots of different reasons that villages get abandoned, and one of the ones that we didn't quite manage to cover earlier, which I think is worth mentioning, is attacks, warfare and raids. So one example of this that I absolutely love is a place called Newtown on the Isle of Wight. And this is actually quite interesting in itself because it's actually a medieval new town, a specifically planned town that was built. Unfortunately, it failed economically, but it left its original layout quite intact. And even though it had quite a promising start, it was quite hopeful, it all came to an end when the French attacked in 1377. Now, what's kind of interesting about this one is that it said that when the French landed, they found there were only middle-aged men left to defend it, and that's possibly where some of the stories about the Pied Piper who spirited away generations of children may have started to spring from. But I kind of like the idea of this, typically this village that was abandoned by its young people. Oh, people are just the same back then as they are today with the young people leaving. Let's have another look at some of the questions. We've got a great question about, are we going to do any more deep time projects? That is a really great question, Julia. So you picked up on the fact that we mentioned a couple of deserted medieval villages that had been uncovered through our own work on a deep time project where over 1,000 people got involved in helping us to search for previously unknown archaeological sites and resulted in the discovery of several deserted medieval villages, among many thousands of other sites as well. The short answer to your question, Julia, is yes. We are currently working behind the scenes to get around 5 new missions started, which should hopefully be launching this winter. And as soon as we're ready to sign people up and start training people how to search for sites, we will absolutely let you know. And who knows what you might find. It might be a deserted medieval village, it might be something else entirely. Do we have any other questions coming up? We have a good question asking, apart from books, is it possible to get acquainted with the reports of archaeological excavations? Yes, absolutely, it is. There's lots of great literature out there. I think Warren Percy is probably a really great place to start. There are lots of technical publications reporting on the discoveries from that site in a lot of detail, and it's absolutely fascinating. I would highly recommend starting there. Freddie, do you have any suggestions for how else people can start to learn about archaeological sites, or any sites that you'd like to recommend people dig into?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, if you want to have a look at maybe less related to deserted medieval villages, but our website has a lot of the reports from our excavations, from previous years' excavations at Sudeley, which is a Tudor garden, so it's not quite the medieval, but it gives you a good sense of the area and kind of all the things we were finding.
And that is a really good reminder as well, because actually, if you look up the East Yorkshire dig, Elmswell, which we've been excavating for the last few years, and focusing on a Roman site, actually the very first year of our excavation on that site was a shrunken medieval village. And we were looking to see if we could trace how far back the village had spread. So yeah, that's a really good suggestion, Freddie. Head to our website and have a look at our reports. Have a look at Sudeley Castle reports and have a look at Elmswell or East Yorkshire and go right back to the beginning, where you'll then find more about another medieval village that we have excavated. Do we have any more questions?
Oh yeah, what were the tokens made from? Yeah, so they're mainly copper alloy. You do sometimes get them made out of iron, but very rarely. So it is mainly copper, because they're tokens, so they're designed to be, quite a cheap thing. You don't want to make tokens out of gold. You tend to make coins out of gold rather, and any of the higher status materials, the metals.
Fascinating. I want to hear a little bit more about some of the medieval pottery because I know you mentioned green glaze. What other kinds of pottery?
Well, you get a lot of different kinds. You get ones that aren't glazed, and they tend to be more locally made, where people just make the pottery for when they need the pottery, rather than the the nicer styled ones. But really, certainly in the medieval period, the green glaze is your most common, whereas people tended to just make things out of wood or bone rather, if they really needed things.
Fascinating. And I can't wait to see how many, if all of those types we might find. When we
Yeah.
start digging at Sudeley, we might find loads, we might find none, we might find something in between. It's very exciting, and we really, really hope that some of you will either join us on the dig or support it online, where you'll then be able to see actually what we're up to and what we're finding, and be part of the discoveries through your support. I think we've probably got time for one last question, which I can see from Pamela, who has asked, have there been many pre-medieval ancient artefacts found in these medieval sites to suggest that the land was inhabited during other periods or suggest a deeper historic significance? I'll just start by saying yes. It's quite typical that settlements get built on earlier settlements. In fact, we've recently dug what is now a medieval village in Ampleforth, where our team did a series of test pits all across the village, helped by people who are living in the village today. And through that process, we're able to map how the village had grown. And it was probably a really good example of a cracked village. So it moved, I think, eastwards over time as the village kind of expanded more on one side than the other. But among the finds, and probably Freddie can help me out here, there were some things that were significantly older than medieval, including flint tools. Can you tell us a little bit about those, Freddie, and what they might imply?
Yeah, so I think we found two flint bladelets that dated probably to the Bronze Age, possibly the early Iron Age, and they were actually found at the Abbey, which is quite funny, as it is as a later abbey, in the 18th century. I think it was built in the 19th century. But yeah, so the flints were clearly, showing this occupation way before Ampleforth, was known as Ampleforth, as a medieval village. And what was actually quite interesting was maybe about 50 meters away, there was actually a Bronze Age barrow. So there could be some relation with that as well.
Yeah, it just shows how people really have been using obviously the same areas for such long periods of time, but also potentially for quite different things. So, where today there is a village or a medieval village, the site of a barrow indicates a very different use of the land at the time. It's more of a ritual landscape, a burial landscape, rather than necessarily where people were settling. But that just tells us to think about how people move across the landscape. Settlements don't stay static over time, exactly as we've seen from some of these examples. They pop up in one place and disappear in another and shift and grow and decline. And mapping those big pictures is really, really, truly fascinating. So I think we're all really grateful that you've all joined us for this live online event. It's been a whistle stop tour of deserted medieval villages. We've only just scratched the surface, and we are really looking forward to digging in a lot more detail in October. So we hope that some of you will join us at Sudeley Castle, and if not, that you'll join us online or on another dig over the summer. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and we will see you all soon, online or in the field. It's archaeology in your hands.